Hello and welcome to The Bits with Joe and Nick. I'm Joe. I run Allplay.
And I'm Nick with Bitewing Games, and we are also joined today by a special guest. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey, my name is Robert Hovakimian, and I'm a game designer, and I've worked with both of these guys, and they decided for some reason I should be here, so here I am.
Well, so this is officially, this is going to be episode 2, right? So
yeah,
episode 2, which we've actually done 3 episodes. Episode 2, we're actually going to talk about something that me and Nick feel is very strong. So on episode 0, we talked about art and board games. On episode 2, we talked about signing board games. And in episode 3, we decided to talk about another huge component of running a board game publishing company, which is development. And we decided to get a real live designer on the podcast. So Robert, thanks for joining us, man.
Yeah, of course. I'm pumped. I cannot wait to talk about what I think is still a secret. So I'm excited to it not be a secret anymore and to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be very exciting. We can talk a lot about that anecdotally for sure. But Nick, why don't you kick us off? Why don't you get the conversation rolling?
Yeah, so Robert, you have a lot of experience in game development, both for developing your personal designs, but also you've worked with Ivy Studios and now Allplay, helping to develop other designers' games. And so we figured you'd be, especially with Allplay's Kickstarter going roughly at the time that this will be posted, this episode, we figured it'd be helpful to bring you on and talk about some relevant games that have recently released or are currently on Kickstarter that you've worked on development for. So I guess, but before we get to that, we want to talk about what is development and like what's the purpose of it? Because typically, we get pitched a design, we sign it, but then oftentimes these games go through a development process before we release them. So what's that all about?
So what it is for me is kind of taking a game from 95% to 100%. So you kind of refine it so it's the best version of itself. You cut out any fluff that might have been there because the designer just had it at some point and never dealt with it. You might fine-tune some numbers. The core is there. Most of the rules are there, but you're finishing it off so that a game that has, a really strong core can still come off as not that fun or fall flat once in a while or have some dead games or some parts of it might feel a little bit clunky. And just by adjusting a few things, you can make a huge difference. So that 5% is really important. And I think that's what development is just finishing out that 5%.
Yeah. I think we all should go around and talk about kind of what development means to us, because I think as a publisher, we might even have different perspectives. So for me, when I look at development, I always look at the development process of making a game the best version of itself it can be. Right? Which if you decide to equate that to the last 5%, like sometimes I've done development and I'm like, the developers did like 40% of the work on this game sometimes, right? But sometimes it really is that fine tuning, that stuff that maybe the designer isn't as good at, right? Or maybe you have a game and the core concept is really fun, but then you get to the end game or the scoring and you're just like, oh, you win or lose, right? And so you have to add in a whole scoring metric so that people feel engaged during the end of the game and they don't just get to the end and go, well, that was fun, but kind of fell flat at the end, right? Sometimes it's a lot of math, right? Sometimes development, depending on the type of game you're making, is a lot of math that needs to be done to make sure that things work correctly. But to me, it's always been about making each game that goes through into development, making it the best version of itself that it can be.
Yeah, I'm in a similar space where I feel like you want to help a game achieve that vision that you all collectively have for it, right? And that could be as simple as balancing the numbers a bit, but it could be as complicated as, this game isn't spicy enough. What do we need to add to this game to make it more spicy or more interesting? So and sometimes we get a game and we feel it's totally perfect. So I feel like not every game needs development, but oftentimes they do, especially new designs that haven't been published before.
I will also say oftentimes the smaller the game, the less development is needed. So for instance, like Rainbow was a card game that we signed. And like, I don't know what the development process of trying to make Rainbow better. Cause like every time we played it, we're like, this game's amazing. We love this game. But like the concept is also so simple that we're like, no development was really needed in order to make this game better. So it really depends a lot of times on like whether the scope is really big or whether the scope is really small, because I feel like the smaller of the game is, sometimes the development is like just a touch, right? Just like sometimes I've actually like given a game to the developers. I'm like, I don't know what this needs, but can you just play it 20 times and make sure that it's not broken? And so like sometimes that's what development looks like as well.
Nice. Yeah, and I feel like in talking to you, Joe, we have slightly different development philosophies of how we go about doing it. And I think it does tie somewhat to what designers we are working with and what they are personally capable of, but also your own, like, I know you have your own philosophy that you've stuck to. So, why don't you share yours?
I got strong feelings on development. I got real big feelings on it. I do not believe in a board game publisher. And again, I think that there are different measures. So for instance, like this does not apply to a company like Leader Games, who's like, we have like a mission statement. And so like if you're a studio, right? So a studio, in my opinion, is a game that primarily designs and publishes the games that they make. Right. So like that's what I would call like the studio model. Like the designers are part of the company. The developers are part of the company. Like everything is in-house, right? Like oftentimes like the art is a part of the company, right? So like Leader Games is the epitome of what I would call as a studio publisher, right? Now, other types of publishers, more traditional publishers, right? And there's also like what I would consider the other far end, which is like more of a localization publisher where honestly, like they're just slapping their logo on a bunch of games from overseas companies and like putting them into the market. But like what me and you, Nick, do is we have very similar companies where we have like what I would call a traditional publishing model where we sign games and then come up with a vision, a theme, artwork, development, everything like that, and publish board games, right? So that's what I would call the traditional model. So when I'm talking about what I feel, I'm mostly talking about from a very traditional model of what my philosophy is. I do not believe in in-house development. I do not believe in hiring staff developers to develop every single game that I work on. And there's a very big reason for that. I think that most developers have strengths and weaknesses. And when all of your games are developed by the same team, you will always develop your games to the same central point, right? So one of the people that I'm friends with in the industry, he's a designer. He believes every game should be a midweight euro. He just believes that. He believes every game should be a midweight euro. So every time he plays a game, when he gives notes on it, like when he gives feedback to the designer, if the game is really light, he's always giving notes on how to add things to it to make it a midweight euro. Or if it's really heavy, he's always trying to like give notes on how to pare it down to be a midweight euro. Because he honestly believes every game should be a 60 to 90 minute midweight euro. That's just how he does it. And if you have a development team where like there's this consensus, right? There's this like flavor of games you want to make. But at All Play, right? Like here at All Play, what we like to do is we like to figure out what is going to make this game the best version of it can be. And I probably have like 6 or 7 different developers that I have worked with over the years that I feel like have different strengths and different abilities. And I will choose the team to work on a game based on what I need that game to do in order for it to reach the vision. And if I feel like I'm just always working with the same team, I'm always going to get the same, I call it, you're going to come up with your flavor of vanilla, right? And I really don't want All Play games to have a flavor of vanilla, right? And that's what I believe that you're going to do. And for some publishers, maybe that's what they want. They want all their games to have a flavor that they have. But I want people to play All Play games and feel different experiences with them. And so that's why I don't like using staff development. I like hiring contract development work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We aren't quite at the point, I feel, where we need a wide variety of developers. Part of the reason for that is just because most of our games come from Reiner Knizia, and he and a few other designers that we worked with, I feel, are in a unique situation compared to most game designers, where Reiner Knizia, he has his own team that he playtests and develops games with. And yeah, maybe they come out as a Reiner Knizia flavor, but that's kind of our intention in signing a game with him, is we want a Reiner Knizia game, right? We want it to kind of hit some core philosophies that he tends to hit with his designs. So yeah, for us, development has looked a little bit different in our initial projects. For example, when we go to Reiner and we tell him like, hey, this isn't working, I'll typically suggest to him ideas as far as what might improve the game, specific weaknesses about the game that we feel could be addressed. And if he's on board to make those tweaks, then he'll go back and test it with his team. And usually if I suggest ideas or solutions to the problem, he'll end up, subverting my expectations and coming up with an entirely different solution, which I think helps as well, because typically, I haven't tested my ideas. I just pitch them out there and be like, hey, this is kind of the issue that we're hoping to address, but maybe you have better ideas. I've seen that same thing working with a few other designers as well, where maybe they also have a good team of playtesters and they're more willing and open to kind of tearing their game apart a little bit and trying wildly different solutions, which I think helps. But that's not the case for most designers. So usually, in most cases, if you're trying to develop a game, you're going to somebody outside of the designer to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a strong philosophy when it comes to the designer doing their own development work, right? And it's a very special case when I trust a designer to do their own development work. And the reason for that is because I feel like in development, there's a lot of what the industry will refer to as like killing your darlings that needs to be done, right? So when you're designing a game, and Robert, as a designer, you probably relate to this, like sometimes you will put a mechanic into a game because you have a problem with the game that you've needed to fix, right? Mm-hmm. And so you like put this thing in the game that fixes that problem. But oftentimes when the developers look at it with fresh eyes, they see this thing. They don't see the 3 months of playtesting it took to add this thing to the game. They just see this like clunky rule that doesn't make sense in the game, right? And they're like, well, let's just rip that out. And you're like, whoa. If you rip that out, it's going to create this problem. And they're like, yeah, but we'll fix that problem a different way. We don't want this like big clunky thing in the middle of the game. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, it's really hard for designers to see that. And I think most designers, kind of when they're ready to sign a game, are ready to just say goodbye to it anyway. Like we're very much like we involve our designers a lot in the process and make sure that our designers like get to see everything and, give thumbs up and everything. But I tell them, I'm like, if it comes down to a war between you and the developers and I need to be the tiebreaker, I'm probably going to side with the developers over the designers, because I think the designers are looking at it from a perspective of, I want this to be the best version of itself it can be. And the designer is a little too close to the project to say, like, I don't feel like removing this or adding this is going to make this the vision that I want, right? And so there's kind of a back and forth there. And I always say, like, I want the designer to be happy with the game, but if there ever comes a tie break one way or the other, I'm usually going to side with the developers. But Robert, as a designer who's like made a lot of your own games that have gone through development, maybe through exterior process, but you've also developed other games, like what's your take on this whole process?
My take is that I think it depends on how attached the designer is to the game. So I've had some games where within like 2 months of starting it, it got signed. And I'm not that attached to it. I don't have that history of spending months on a single issue. So I'm still able to kind of look at it with fresh eyes relatively. And these are generally simpler games too. But for example, a game that I signed with Nick, Shuffle and Swing, that was like 2.5 years of me working on it. And then when I had to also develop it, it was a bit brutal at that point, where I was just like kind of like working on that game, for so long, and I was so into it. And so like, I think then I would have liked maybe an external developer. I still think we did a great job. It was super helpful to have Nick and Kyle kind of also being developers in some sense, with suggestions. But I think that's a case where if you've been like if you've like poured a lot of energy into a single game, it might be a good thing for you to take a step back and let somebody else just deal with it for a little bit. But if it's something relatively simple, I think it might make sense for the designer to develop. And a big thing that I personally have, just the thought of somebody else developing the game is a little scary to me. There's like this control that you want to have over it, where it's like, no, it's my game. You don't understand, right? But that's maybe just an ego thing that everybody has just as a human, and you kind of have to let go at some point and be okay with it.
Yeah, and honestly, a lot of those like bumps are smoothed over when the royalty check comes. So
yeah, that's fair. Yeah, my worry with working with external developers is that they have their own tastes and preferences, and those may not match up with my tastes and preferences or the designer's tastes and preferences, and they try to, alter the feel of the game in the way that we were not hoping for, and then we end up kind of spinning our wheels where we're paying these developers to take the game in a direction that we don't want it to go, but we don't find that out till after they do it. And then so that's where I guess I've been lucky enough where the few designers that I have worked with, they either work in a design team or they've had so much experience making so many different games that they're okay to just take my feedback and really run with it. And I guess every time I've given feedback and they've been like, okay, I'm going to try to implement this, and they bring it back, I end up really happy with the result. So I haven't felt the urge to be like, okay, we need to find someone outside of this designer to fix these issues. But I'm sure we'll get to that point eventually. It's just a matter of time, having the certain game that we need to develop beyond the designer's capabilities. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the designer's personality. Like, I think Nick has seen me with just pitch him some just games that are good. They're not great. And then they just die. I just kill them. I'm like, whatever. It's not great. I don't care. So it depends on kind of your attitude. And I think I'm also that way when it comes to rules or mechanisms in my own games, where I'm like, oh, this was dumb after all. I'll just kill it. It's like you can get attached, but there's definitely a way to not be that attached. And I think if you're somebody who doesn't get that attached and just treats it as not your baby, but just as a game rule, whatever, it's just a game, kind of, a bit more of a detached perspective, it might be easier for you to develop your own games than if you are somebody who gets hyper attached.
Yeah. So should we talk about a couple of development journeys that our companies have been on? Because I think we both have some development journeys that Robert has been involved with.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that kind of the core, I guess, mascot of this particular episode, I feel, is going to be Merchants of Andromeda, which, as I witnessed, and Joe knows better than anyone, that has been on a serious development journey. Joe, do you want to go through the history of that right up till Robert joined the development?
Whew. It's a saga. It is a saga. I feel like I could turn this into a 3-part epic if I wanted to. I could just Peter Jackson the heck out of this thing. All right. So and again, this started 3 years ago, I think. 3 years ago, which is crazy to think about. Maybe it's closer to 2.5, but we had signed our first game from Reiner Knizia. And Reiner Knizia worked with us. He was really happy with what we had done with Pollen. And he came to us, and I got to take some pitches at Essen. And basically, he gave me a whole bunch of his older titles that he was interested in us redoing. Of that, some of the ones that we were interested in was Money was up. So we were able to take Money and redo that, which was on Kickstarter in October, and it should be releasing sometime around May next year. But then in addition to Money, there was a whole pile of games. And Through the Desert was not a part of that. That was a separate thing. But that happened a little bit after, but then we kind of rushed that forward because it's Through the Desert. But one of the games is actually a game that I don't think, Robert, you had played up until that point. And Nick, I don't know that you've actually played Merchants of Amsterdam. Is that one of the Reiner Knizias that you've missed?
So that actually, I acquired a new copy of that, and it sat on my shelf for months because when I cracked it open, that thing was just so ugly and it looked so dry. And I was like, the Dutch auction clock here looks really interesting, but I just don't have the motivation to learn this and teach it to other people. And then I heard you guys were working on it, and that was like a weight off my shoulders. I'm like, I'm just going to sell this game before even trying it and wait for your version to come out because I know it'll be easier to get to the table.
So, Merchants of Andromeda, or Amsterdam, which is now Merchants of Andromeda. So, Merchants of Amsterdam, right, was this game from, I think, the 90s or early 2000s. It's an old game, right? And it looks it. And we played it. So we got back from Essen and we had all these games and we're like, all right, we're going to power through and see what we really, really like and what we want to do. We played Merchants of Amsterdam and two things stuck out to us. Number one, we really loved the Dutch auction. We loved it. Number two was there was this really fun decision space in the game where you would draw a card and have to decide whether you wanted to keep it, discard it, or put it up for auction before drawing the next one. And that was a very tense, interesting decision point that everybody was making the entire time they were playing the game. And then the Dutch auction was really fun. The rest of the game we felt was very, very old, right? It felt very dusty. And basically what I told Reiner Knizia was this game feels like three different flavors of area control. Like you do area control on an ocean, and then you do area control in a like space in the warehouses, and then you do area control on a resource track. And I was like, it just feels like you're just doing area control, area control, area control, area control, and you're just auctioning for different types of area control. Mm-hmm. And what I told Reiner Knizia was like, I think this game would be a lot more fun if we kind of expanded the space of the game a little bit, and instead of it just being all kind of the same type of area control, if we had these like different really fun mini games that you would get to play that were basically like doing different things and altering the game in different ways, and you were kind of competing with the other players in these mini games, but we were fundamentally still using the Dutch auction and then the mechanism of drawing a card and deciding what to do with it as like the means to perform these mini games, right? And Reiner wrote a very long dissertation back to me about what he felt was development, like his development philosophies, right? And I was like, okay, I totally understand this. This makes a lot of sense. Let's like, but if he was basically ultimately like, we trust you, whatever you want to do to this game. Like, it's pretty old. Nobody has really been clamoring for it. So like, we trust you to do something good with it. So I hired a developer. And honestly, this developer was a designer where I like their games. I really enjoyed what they did. And they also, like, some of the games that they've developed were like other Reiner Knizia games. And I don't really want to name their name, even though I really respect the work that they put in, and I respect them as a person. And maybe on a future project, I would be happy to work with them. But what I found out after working with them is I gave them the game, Merchants of Amsterdam, and I gave them kind of my design brief idea, which is like, hey, it's like a bunch of mini games. And what I got back was a game where the auction was severely minimized, and I felt like the game was very procedural. It was very much just like this procedural Euro that you were going through. And I don't think it was bad, but it was not what I wanted. So I kept trying to like get the developer to like tweak it and make changes. And I was getting like a lot of like pushback, or the changes that I was getting were like not like the change that I wanted and more like a different direction. And I was like, I don't feel like this is a good development process that we're having here. So I finished out that contract and I actually paid that developer in full for all the work that they did. So I didn't try to short them or anything. I paid them in full because they had put in the work. Mm-hmm. I then gave it to a different group of developers that I work with quite often. And I said, hey, here's what this thing is. Could you maybe work on it? Here's what I want. And it kind of sat with them for like 3 or 4 months and no movement really happened. It might have sat with them for longer than that. And finally, I was just like so frustrated. I was like, I know you guys are really busy, but is there anything that's going to happen? And they're like, honestly, we're just not that into it. We're probably not the best fit, right? And I was like, fair enough. And so then the game just sat with me for like several months while I was just like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? So finally, I had met Robert at Dice Tower West, and I actually liked Robert a lot. Like as a human being, I liked Robert, and I liked like the different things. He pitched me a couple of games. and stuff like that. And so like I enjoyed spending time with Robert, and I felt like the designs he showed me showed a lot of potential. And so I contacted Robert. I was like, hey, do you do like development work? And he's like, I've developed my own games, I guess. And I was like, okay, I have a Reiner Knizia game that needs development. And he was like, ooh, I would love to work on a Reiner Knizia game. And I was like, okay, here's the design brief. And I kind of gave him the project in the state that it was in. And I think you like looked at the rules and looked at everything that was like kind of presented. And you were like, I just want to play the original Merchants of Amsterdam. And so Robert played Merchants of Amsterdam. And then he also kind of looked at like the current prototype, and he was like, I would rather kind of throw all this away and work from scratch, if you don't mind, rather than try to like reconfigure this like kind of like thing that multiple people's hands have been in that like you aren't really happy with or satisfied. I'd rather change the original game than try to change this thing that you've handed me, right? And I was like, totally fine. Like, it's absolutely fine. No problem at all. And so then Robert became the developer on that project, and we are about to launch it on Kickstarter in January 2025. And I think we signed this game in like 2023. Right. So Robert maybe can like now weigh in a little bit on like what that development process actually looked like, because at that point, like, honestly, like I was like sick to death of it. And I was just like, please deliver me something that is like to the brief of what I want. And I have to be honest with you, I am so excited to release this game because I think Robert did a phenomenal job on this game.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, it was so fun to work with. I think because it was my first time dealing with Knizia like in any direct way whatsoever, I was like so nervous because he's, you know, if I have a hero in this world, he's my hero. And so I think that pressure was kind of a good thing. So I was like, I cannot mess this up. I have to do good. But yeah, the process was, I don't even think I looked at the rules of the old prototype. You showed me like a picture of it, and I saw like, something that was more complex than I thought the game would be. And so I was like, I don't even want to know what the rules were. I don't want it to influence me. Not because they were bad, just I wanted to start totally fresh, like he said. And so when Joe talked to me about it, he was basically like, we want to keep three things: the Dutch auction, most money wins, and also the action selection with the cards. And he's like, everything else you can do whatever you want to it. And of the three flavors of area majority, I thought one of them was actually, you know, maybe not vanilla, but like chocolate. You know, it wasn't amazing, but it was still really good. I liked it. There's this like Andromeda mini game that happens kind of in the center, where it's area majority, but you care about having like a group, and there's little bonuses you can get by crossing over bridges. I thought that was good, and I kept that. But kind of the other stuff that was happening, the other vanilla area majority, we changed. And so it started off by me doing a SWAT analysis, because I know that's what Nick does, and I figured if it's worked for Bitewing, surely it'll work here as well. And then I wrote up a pretty long kind of proposal of like stuff I would keep, stuff I would change. I mocked up a few like images just so that you could have a sense of what it would look like. And the core ideas there kind of did stick through to the end, because Joe also mentioned he wanted some kind of like voting mini game. So I came up with a voting mini game. And then I just thought about what might happen in this universe. So we have like exploring different planets. We have fighting or defending, you know, your home base. And so this kind of all stuck. And inside this like big proposal, there were a few changes that Knizia pointed out in a response. He responded in an email, and he was like, I don't think it makes sense for the active player to be the one who receives the money from the auction. That was what I thought I might do, and I think it was like that before too. And he pointed out that it essentially takes the active player out of the auction, because then if they win the auction, they kind of lose the opportunity of gaining money. They kind of double pay for it. I was like, oh, yeah, that's true. So I just trusted him. I was like, I'm going to trust this guy. So I didn't even try it. And then he also mentioned that I had a few places where I thought about throwing in variable bonuses, because I also wanted to keep the resource tracks, but kind of make it maybe a bit more economic, where like the higher a resource was, the more its bonus paid out in other sections of the game. And he was like, that just seems like a lot. And I was like, okay, I'll trust it. You know, won't do it. So I didn't even try it. And I think his general fear was that it was maybe a very American approach of just like, I think he described it as building skyscrapers kind of on top of his system. And so I tried to be very wary of that. Like, I don't want to make a game that he doesn't like. Maybe he doesn't love it, but at least he appreciates it. And so I did try to keep things as simple as possible. And ultimately, while we have a bunch of mini games, I think we did keep things fairly simple and streamlined. And so I think maybe Kanitian in spirit, right? Kind of very, very simple ways to resolve things. Not particularly procedural or even particularly heady. The focus is very much on the auction and just, fun, dumb stuff happening where you're like, you paid what for that? Those kind of moments. That was kind of always at the core of it.
I have to tell you, man, I played this just the other day and I paid like 15 for an exploration action in an auction. And my first flip was a curse. And I was like, oh my goodness. Like, I just literally just put my hands in my head. And I was just like, I paid $15. And then so I flipped over the next tile and it was like an ice or something. It was like an ice resource. And I was like, I paid $15 for an ice resource and one token on the smallest planet of the scoring. And I was just like, oh my goodness. And it was just, everybody laughed at me. But I was like, ooh, I'm going to get 2 more relics. I just felt so strong about it. And I was just like, first flip, curse. I was like, good night.
Oh man. Yeah, I'm super excited about this game because I saw a little bit of the development journey as it went along. I think when it was with the second set of developers, I tried a version of it, and this was now like 18 months ago or something. It was a long time ago. And I remember feeling like, this doesn't really feel like a Knizia game. And I remember at one point, Joe, you were saying like, maybe we'll just give the game back to Reiner. So I had mentioned Robert to you as well because of all the designers that I've seen or worked with or even played their games of, to me, Robert feels like he follows Reiner's design philosophy the closest of, very intertwined player interaction with, more streamlined and focused rule sets. And so it was cool to see how Robert was able to, and maybe this isn't possible for every game, but he was able to maintain Reiner's design philosophy, but hit your vision for the game. Cause I remember you talking about, I want there to be unique mini games, for this that all feel really interesting and exciting and that kind of thing. And also, I love what you did with I know this isn't specifically tied to development, but I love what you did with the artwork. I have a couple images to show here. We've got the box cover and the other direction, and some of the sci-fi Easter eggs that have gone on here. You've sent me some of these as they've been completed, Joe, and I love the little Easter eggs that you guys have nestled into this game. I think it really brings out the vibe and the mood of the game, right?
So one of the reasons I could not throw this game in the trash, right? The number one reason I couldn't throw this game in the trash was because early on, I had this vision for the art, like we talked about in the art episode and stuff, like how I get this vision in my head. And I knew the artist I wanted to work with, and I knew the overall look that I wanted this game to have, right? And I was so determined that I actually hired the artist, like while the development was in process. Cause like honestly, up to this point, I had never had a huge issue when it came to development, right? So I was like, oh, things are moving forward. So like I paid for the art, and like I got like a box cover, and then I got like some card art. And I was like, well, I know those two things are going to be in the game. There's going to be cards. There's going to be a box. So I'll get started on those, right? And then I couldn't get started on anything else. So like the artist kind of finished, and then honestly just sat waiting for me for like 20 months to like get the game to a place where I was like, I think we can actually start moving forward now. And so this was like this like huge vision of like what I had of like this like intergalactic space station where all of these races are living. But then you also have like these merchants that are like doing these different things, trying to like have this like economic foothold in this like big intergalactic space station. And I just really loved how much life and character the artist was able to bring to it. And I was just so incredibly satisfied with like the final product that this is going to be.
Yeah, I had a chance to try a near finished version of what Robert was developing as well. And I feel like the personality of the artwork and the mini games just fit so well together. Like you mentioned, Joe, that there's a push your luck element to the exploration and some of these other things that bring a lot of personality to the game. And it's one of my most anticipated games for this year. So very exciting to see that the development worked out for this game, despite it being a roller coaster.
And one thing I will say is, I believe, Robert, you designed a lot of the mini games off of other Reiner Knizia designs, correct?
I looked through, well, there's some that are very clearly taken from there. So for example, in the fight section, there's a way to get like enemy ships, and the player who has the most enemy ships when it scores gets points or money, and the player who has the least loses them. That's just straight up pharaohs from Raw. And just generally the ideas of like set collection, push your luck. But none of them are just me looking at another game and saying, another Knizia game and saying, oh, let me just kind of make that a mini game. They're more just like inspired by.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think Reiner does have some games where like you flip over tiles and try to remember where they are and make matches, which is kind of like what's happening with the explore section. And of course, he has so many dice games, right?
Right.
So I think inevitably it's going to be inspired. But none of them are like, oh, this was me doing. Oh, well, there was actually one moment in the development where there were 5 mini games instead of 4, and one of the mini games was about like making connections between things to get markets, and that was a little through the deserty, but that ended up dying anyways. But yeah, certainly whenever I was stuck, I was always like, what would Knizia do? That was kind of that was the guiding factor.
I'm sure he appreciates, and why I'm glad that I have you, because like I do think Reiner is going to be very happy with the way that this game comes out and everything. So, Nick, do you want to talk at all about kind of maybe some of the development journey that you went on with Robert when it came to working on Bbop?
Absolutely, yeah. Bbop was an interesting one because it's the one that kind of opened the door for us working with Robert on that game and Shuffle and Swing, and then several more to come. Because and of course the common thread there is it's very Knizia-esque as well, which we're obviously interested in at Bitewing Games. So I remember Bbop, when you pitched it to us, Robert, had a more dull theme perhaps, or maybe a more generic theme, and that was kind of I think the starting point of our development process, as well as introducing more spicy moments to the game. Do you remember a bit of that late stage Bbop development?
Yeah, so the theme was originally like merchants selling stuff, just because I'm not a theme guy. I was like, I don't really care what the theme is at the end of the day. So I just needed a theme that made a little bit of sense, and that was good enough. But then Nick mentioned he didn't like the theme, and so I started asking my playtesters about like what themes might make sense. And for some reason, performers kept getting mentioned a lot, and I love jazz, so I was like, okay, let's just jazz it. And so I came back like 2 days later with a jazz theme, and it worked. It's still an abstract game, but it works. It's not like, totally nonsensical. So that was kind of like the very first thing we did. And then another big thing was Nick wanted another map. So I started working on another map for the game, just a separate board on the backside of the base game board. And in doing that, I was like, I think I could make like 3 more. And so we ended up making 3 more maps. Just because I had all these ideas and I didn't want to throw them all into one board, because I very much like to work at like, what's the core of this, and just like support the core. Don't just do a bunch of, random stuff. So we had like 3 core ideas, and we built 3 maps around those 3 core ideas.
I'm still waiting for Nick to release the secret expansion for Bbop, which is the Fire Festival expansion, where things are just going horribly wrong, and you also have to like feed all of your people. So that's really what I'm waiting for.
Yeah, co-designed by Uwe Rosenberg. That's what we call
Yeah, there we go. That sounds pretty epic.
And then the other thing was that we did want some spice. So the game that it's kind of most inspired by is Samurai, and Samurai has these like special tiles everybody has access to. And I think maybe they existed, but there's only like 2 of them, and they weren't particularly spicy. They were just kind of like more flexibility. And so the final kind of tweaks we did was to add a few more spicy things that like let you take 2 actions in one, or let you kick somebody else out. So it's very minor stuff. None of the core rules, or even, the secondary rules changed much. It was all tertiary stuff for that game.
Yeah, I think that one ended up going pretty smoothly because the core game was solid to begin with. And we're working on a game right now that we're not going to reveal any details about. But what's interesting to me about that game is that game also feels very solid. But we're at the point where we feel, this could have really cool components to it thematically. So how do we integrate those components in a gameplay sense into the game, right? And make those like the showcase component of the whole game, and not make it feel like it's like shoehorned into the gameplay, right? So that's interesting, to have different challenges of development. But I guess I know we're running out of time with Joe. He has a meeting soon. So I want to ask Robert one more question, and maybe it's a two-part.
I got time, by the way, Nick.
Okay. Okay.
Time. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I guess next question is, how do you know when development is complete? Like, at what point are you just overdeveloping a game, or, when do you know, like, how did you know Merchants of Andromeda was finally at its sweet spot?
Joe said he liked it. I feel like,
there you go.
I think publishers and developers might have a different answer to this question. So I'm curious what you guys think too, because 99% of the time I could keep working on a game if I really wanted to. You can always find something. I could be sitting there with an Illustrator doc open and I'm like, should that cost 3 or 4? And I could just be thinking about that question for like 10 minutes or more than that. But at the end of the day, I think the time that I know it's ready is when I am not thinking about the development side of it while playing. I am just playing it, and I forget that I even had anything to do with designing or developing. It's like, it's just a game now, I'm not like, oh shoot, I forgot that thing's broken, or just, I like, in the back of my mind there's always these like kind of letdowns, kind of like, dang it, that thing is still broken, and I kind of feel bad while playing it. But when that's totally gone, then I know it's kind of ready. Maybe we could tweak some stuff to get it, to like excellent from like very good or amazing, but it's pretty much done at that point.
There's a core thing when it comes to publishing board games that I think is very important, especially if you are a smaller publisher that is kind of like listening to this podcast to like learn. I think this is a very important thing, and I really want you to grab this and take this with you, because I sat for over 5 years at Panda Games Manufacturing watching publishers make this mistake over and over and over again, and most of them don't have companies anymore. Okay? And here's what the thing is. Nobody that plays your game is going to have any clue about that final 2% of the game that you think is super crucial and super important, right? Like, I have watched publishers literally spend months making a decision on what color purple to make the purple player pieces in their games, right? And they're like, I need you to send me these 10 Pantone samples of these of all the player components in these 10 different purple colors, so I can look at them all side by. And guess what? Nobody that ever got that game has ever once sat down and thought about, man, this is a really, really great shade of purple that they decided to use for these components. Like, this just really, like, if it had been any of those purple colors, no one would have given it a second thought, right? Like not one person, right? But there are so many. And so like development is often the same way. There's always, like Robert was saying, something that you could keep tweaking, something that you could keep working on. But is the game fun? Are people enjoying it? And so this is where I make the decision on when development is done. Developers will come to me with the game and they will say, here, I'm done. And then when me and the designer both have an agreement that we say, we're really happy with the work that's been done here, then development is done. Because a lot of times developers will come to me and go, the game is done. And then the designers are like, whoa, like this whole thing is just not like this whole thing is like kind of weird. Or I'll play it and I'll be like, I don't know, man, like that end game is really falling flat. And so like, okay, like we'll put a little bit more work in, right? But so like sometimes like developers will come 3 times and say, okay, the game is done, right? And that's fine. Like, I'm not saying the developers did a bad job if they come to me and I find a flaw with something that they've worked on. But the game is done when the developers say, I'm finished, and both me and the designer go, good, we're really happy with what this product is.
Nice. Yeah, I have a couple interesting experiences with over-developing a game, actually. I have to be very careful about what instructions I give to either the designer or the developer as far as what direction we want to take their game in, because I've seen them go too far with it, and we've had to take a step back to find that sweet spot. And I think part of it is it is possible to overdevelop a game to the point where you're just trying to make a game that everybody is okay with, nobody hates. But then often you end up with a game that nobody loves either. Oftentimes when you're making these decisions about what kind of experience you put into the game, they're going to end up being polarizing. But in my opinion and my philosophy is that I'd rather have a game that a good, solid base of people really, really love. And it's okay if other people really hate that same part of the game. I'd rather have that than just a game that everyone's like, it's okay. It's not bad, and maybe that direction is the one you want to go if you want really good sales or if you want to make a really good first impression with as many people as possible. But I'd rather have a dedicated hardcore fan base that keeps the game alive and generates its own fan base community than one that is just quickly forgotten. And so one example of this is in Ego, which used to be Beowulf the Legend. There was a very polarizing element of the risk mechanism where people would be bidding with their hand of cards in an auction to stay in the auction, but then you can always take a risk each time it's your turn to bid where you just flip cards from the deck and those may get added to your bid. And so it's kind of this wild element of lucky top decking added to a very strategic game. And so obviously that was very polarizing in Beowulf the Legend. And I brought that up to Reiner as like, hey, a lot of people really love this element, but a lot of people really hate it as well. And I didn't suggest anything, but I mentioned it as a potential weakness. Well, what he ended up doing during the development process was he flipped it on its head where suddenly you would be penalized for a successful risk instead of being penalized in the original game for an unsuccessful risk. And so he basically made it an economic trade-off instead of a push your luck element. He changed the whole feel of the game. And then I was worried like, oh shoot, everybody who loved the original Beowulf for its push your luck antics is going to hate this new version because it's not push your luck anymore. So what we did is we actually came up with an idea that was kind of like halfway between the two, where maybe the penalty of pushing your luck wasn't quite as bad as the original Beowulf, not quite as polarizing, but it's still there and it's still spicy, where you do get penalized for a failure. And if it's a success, it's a huge success and it feels really good to do that. So there's elements like that where I feel like you can overdevelop a game and make it too balanced or too milquetoast, and then it loses its personality or character.
I think overdevelopment is a huge fear. I think you can just keep sanding away at a game until it like you look at it and you go, what did I even sign? Like, what was the game that I originally signed anyway? Like, what did I love about it? And so, like, for me, a big part of development is when I sign a game and I go, what do I love about this? Like, what is the thing that I love about this? And then, so this is a good thing to throw back to Merchants of Amsterdam. When I signed that game, I told Reiner, I love this Dutch auction and I love this mechanism of drawing the cards, right? And I was like, those are the two things I want to shine in this game, right? And the first development pass that I went through was not good and basically minimized both of those things in a really big way. And so that's the thing, is like, it lost what I loved about the game. And every time when I'm in development, my development process brief is usually designed around the core aspect of like, what do I love about this game and how can I develop it to make that thing the best thing that it can be? Right. And that's what I think core development should be from publishers, not how do I perfectly balance this, or how like some of the best games in the world are very unbalanced, right? They're very unbalanced, right? But I think some of the best games in the world are self-balancing to a degree. Right. And I think like players self-balancing games is like a huge reason that players want to return to them. Right. Where trying to figure out like not, oh, this strategy is overpowered, but it's like, okay, but how do you combat that strategy? Like one player found one kind of like system that works in the game. How are the other systems in the game balanced against competing against that? And when honestly you play like a perfectly balanced game, I oftentimes, this is my opinion when it comes to like perfect balancing, right? When you play a game that's perfectly balanced, what decisions are you even making? right? Like what decisions are you actually making? If it's perfectly balanced, then it doesn't matter what decisions you're making because everything's going to kind of come out to the same even amount of points. And it really just comes down to like infinitesimal amounts of like minor luck in the game, like card draws, dice rolls, yada, yada. Or it comes down to players just not playing optimally, right? And what I want games to be dynamic and fun and interesting and unique. And that's where I feel like development should make those things shine. I don't think you should be trying to perfectly balance a game.
Been so helpful for us to maintain a clear vision of what we want the game to become and what issues we're trying to address, because you lay out in the SWAT, you lay out the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. So if what you're doing with development, if it's not enhancing the strengths and highlighting them, then why are you doing it? If it's not eliminating or solving the weaknesses, then why are you doing it? And that's something that even during the Ego Beowulf development process, Reiner came back to me a few months later and he's like, I could take this game in so many directions. So we met up together again and he's like, what do you like about this game? He was actually interviewing me as sort of a developer, where he's like, okay, what aspects do you like of the game? What do you feel are essential to keep? And so I just brought up my SWOT analysis again, and I just went over the strengths that I had written up at the start of the development process. It was like, okay, back to this. This is exactly what we want to keep. You know, the epic push your luck game of chicken auctions. And as far as the weaknesses, we feel like, you know, here's what we can address, and just kind of refocusing the developer, in this case, Rainer Knizia, on what we felt was special about the game and the direction we wanted to take it really helped it to get to that finish line. And Robert, I know you've been developing quite a few of your own games recently, and this past year, it seems like you've had quite a few games that you've either killed or you've designed and developed in wildly different directions. So I'm interested to hear your take. Like, what lessons have you learned about development during these past year or so?
I think the big one is, I think you guys have pretty much brought it up, but it's to always keep in mind the core of the game, or kind of like a motif. That, like, with every game, I think of some kind of motif. So like the game I'm working on right now that's been signed with you, Nick, that you're talking about, we want that fun component. The motif is everything you do opens up an opportunity for your opponents. And like anything I do, I'm thinking like, is that still true now? Am I servicing that kind of core motif? So never breaking away from the core, because it's so easy to get lost in the numbers and then like come out of like a 2-hour just like weird trip where you're like, what did I even do? Like, what is this? Like, what, you've kind of like lost the thread. And so to kind of always keep that in mind. I would say that's the first and the biggest lesson. And then I think the second one is something about overdeveloping, where I tend to overdevelop when I get bored. Like if I'm playtesting something too much, I'm like, I'm not sure if this isn't fun, or if I've just played it 1,000 times and anything kind of gets boring after 1,000 plays. And so am I changing it because it's not fun, or am I changing it just because I want to service my own boredom and like try something else for fun, even though it's not what is best for the game? So I think those two things that I try to keep in mind a lot now, after having maybe kind of bad experiences of overdeveloping or losing the thread in the past.
Nice.
So, Nick, I would ask, do you have any other, I know that you've worked with Reiner a lot and you've done some other things, but do you have any other interesting development stories or things that have come out of development that you've been like, man, I'm so glad we made that change, because that change really improved the game in a huge way?
Oh, Cascadero was another one where when we played the game originally, we really liked it, and we pretty much signed it right away with Knizia. The interesting thing was I did present to him a SWOT analysis, and I told him, like, hey, we feel there could be a backside of the board to this, and that board could be variable to kind of just mix things up, because the front side of the board has the same setup every time, and if you're playing just the base rules, not the advanced rules, it has the potential where players can kind of play it in the same way. So we had suggested to him, hey, maybe a backside of the board with a variable setup would be really helpful. But in that same process, I also suggested to him, I worry that some players might feel that the seal token might be overpowered. The way the seal works is the whole point of Cascadero, you're building these envoys that connect to new towns. And when they're a group of envoys that connect to a town, you score the town because they trust your group. But if you do it with just a single envoy that's not part of a group, you connect it to a town, it doesn't score. But the cool thing is you can earn these seals from Cascadero where you can go in with a solo envoy and trigger the town scoring without having to build up to it over multiple turns. And so, yeah, it was really nice to earn those, and it felt really awesome, but they were also very powerful. And the worry was like, what if players look at this as like a runaway leader problem? And I don't know if they will, but that was my worry as a publisher. You don't want people to develop this thought of like, oh, this game has an issue, so don't buy it. You know, that's not where you want to end up. So I mentioned that to Reiner, and he ended up like cutting out the legs from under the seal token strategy, where now it didn't score as powerfully as it used to. And I remember this was months later that I played it again with this new rule set that Reiner gave us, and I just felt like this isn't as fun as it used to be. Why is that? And I realized that like because I had brought that up, it again goes back to the overdevelopment, right? Where suddenly the game and the seal tokens weren't as fun and as spicy and interesting as they used to be. So I ended up toying with the design myself and coming up with a solution where people who earn seal tokens were missing out on another opportunity that opens up to the people who weren't earning those seal tokens. And now there were two competing strategies that were both powerful and interesting rather than just one like weak, you know, kind of sour or boring version of the game. So I felt like that was really, really interesting to see. And I think this is important for publishers or the designer maybe when they play a developed version of the game that's different from what they had before, try to remember what it was like to play it initially and compare your feelings and make sure it's headed in the right direction. But what about you, Joe? Do you have any stories?
Yeah, so I got a big one. I signed pretty much like on the spot this game from Peter Hayward called Things and Rings, right? It's been a really big success for us this last year. When I signed it, there were 3 rings. There was the word ring, there was the attribute ring, and then there was a 3rd ring, which was a personal fact about the knower themselves, right? Like it was a get to know the person you're playing the game with kind of a thing that was like in this game, right? And so like it was like things like I like it or I hate it or I have this at work with me, right? Or like just like it was like those types of things, right? And I remember I kept playing the game over and over and over, right? And I loved so much of the concepts of what was happening. And what I started doing is I started just playing without that red ring because people were like, oh, this feels so arbitrary. Like, I don't know you. Right? They're like, how would I know that this is something that like you have at your office or that you have in your home or yada, 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 right? And so I was like playing the game with only 2 rings and just kind of like, man, it feels like there really wants to be a 3rd ring. And I remember I had gotten done with like a big play testing session, at the Dice Tower retreat 2 years ago. Not this past year, but the year before that. And I went to Peter Hayward and I called him, I was like, man, people really hate this red ring. And he's like, that's the best part of the game. What are you talking about? I'm like, I really think it needs to change. And we were like texting each other back and forth. And all of a sudden I was like texting like the developers too, because they were kind of working on the game just very briefly at the very beginning stages of it. And I was like, hey, like, do you guys have time to hop on a quick call? And we were like talking about it. And like in that meeting, we basically came up with a 3rd category, which was like where the thing is found or how people in general feel about it. So it became we basically took the personal out of it and took more of like the overall world context for this thing, right? And that became what the new red ring was. And I just started playing the game again with like those rules, just kind of making up like most people have this in their home. You can buy this in a store, yada, yada. And like, or instead of like, I've bought this from a store in the last year or something like that, right? It became so much less arbitrary and people really started loving the game. And I was like, okay, that was and the designer even said like afterwards, like that was the absolute right move for the game. That was exactly what that game needed. And so like I've seen things like that happen where like you really like I tell designers this sometimes. I'm like, trust the publisher. because nobody wants your game to sell more copies than the publisher, right? I tell the designers this all the time. Like, there's so many times the designers are like, I don't know. And I'm like, we want to sell games more than you want us to sell games. Trust me on that, right? Like, there is no publisher that's like, this is I don't really care if this does well or not. Don't work with publishers like that. Like, we want to sell 1 million copies of your game, and we're making decisions to try to sell as many copies of your game as we can. So when we have an idea, or when we want to take things a certain direction, or when we want to put anthropomorphic animals in the game, just trust us, because the decision that we're making is based on wanting to sell as many games as possible. And those are where those instincts come from. And again, if you're a new publisher, I think that there's a lot of learning to do with working with the designers and taking a lot of feedback and stuff like that. But I think, like, as the more you've done this, the more you've had successful products, the more your instincts are going to become correct and are going to grow, right? If this is like, if you've only made 2 games, I don't know that you know what it takes to make a successful product yet, right? But as you publish 10, 15, 20, 30, 80 games, right? Like, you're going to have better instincts on what the market wants and how the market is changing, and be able to influence decisions to help games succeed in the current market better than what the designers and developers are able to do as well.
I think one more thing that's maybe helpful for publishers and developers, especially as they're evaluating a game and trying to decide, is this overdeveloped? Do we need to develop it in a certain direction? Is just playing lots of games in general. I feel like this has been so helpful for me as I've done a little bit of development work on our games, but I would consider myself more a development director, where I turn it back on to usually the designer if I trust them, and tell them, like, hey, you need to develop the game probably in this direction, or here's what's missing about the game. Now go figure out, how to fill these holes or fix this issue. Is that the fact that I've played so many games, and I tend to play about 50 of the year's releases. So, like, I've played about 50 releases from 2024. And try to do a wide variety of games as well, is I feel like I get a sense for what makes a game interesting, and what is making it hot and popular with people, and what is making it maybe forgettable or kind of, vanilla or whatever it is. And I remember we have another mythology game, 2-player mythology game that we're launching later this year, where this design team brought me this really solid game that they had built from the ground up with a unique mythology. And we were ready to sign it, but I mentioned to them, like, hey, I feel like this game should have more spice, more texture to it. It has a system kind of like Pandemic, where you reveal these cards and this enemy spreads across the map. But it was very vanilla. It was very kind of one note. Like, when you reveal the card, it's very predictable what was going to happen. And so I suggested to them, like, hey, maybe there's just a little bit of variety to how these cards, their strengths and things like that. Maybe we can put a little bit more texture into the game. And I feel like the fact that I've just played so many games and really evaluated my feelings on those games as I play them, and been like, okay, why did I not like this game? Why did I feel this game was boring? And I end up writing about it in a blog post. I don't feel like everybody has to do that. But if you're actually evaluating your feelings on a game and what works for you and what doesn't, it becomes so much easier to look at projects you're working on and figure out, okay, you apply the same mentality to it of this is what's wrong with it, and here's what probably needs to be fixed about it, and then letting the developers loose on that vision.
Yeah, I like reading your blog posts because they're very well written. I personally just don't feel like I have too many friends in the industry to keep giving their games fair prognoses. So I feel like at a certain point, like, publishers are going to start being like, yeah, thanks for all of your 3 ratings on my games, Joe.
I try to be, speaking of fair, I try to be fair and evaluate a game based on, like, okay, it doesn't work for my preferences, but here's what I think is great about the game. And if you're into this kind of thing, then you'll enjoy it, right? But yeah, that's something to be...
I get so angry every time Nick gives one of my games a fair prognosis. I'm like, really, Nick? Really? Okay.
Has he given you poor yet? Have you got him that?
I don't think we don't make poor games, Robert.
Yeah, I'll play those make bad games.
No, it's totally fair. It's okay. One day I'll share my thoughts on Cascadero.
That midnight play that we probably shouldn't have broken it out for. That's a good time.
Yeah, Nick was like, ooh, you know what? The first day after PAX Unplugged, when everyone's tired at like 11 p.m. at night, you know what's going to be a good thing? Let me teach everyone how to play Cascadero.
Well, in my defense, half of you enjoyed it, so it wasn't a total bust.
Yeah. There's only two of them.
Kyle and Nick enjoyed it.
Chris enjoyed it too. He still plays that game.
No, it was good.
Yeah, good times. So I guess, Robert, do you have any other interesting development stories or examples to close us out here?
Ooh, on the spot. Not ones I could talk about. No, I don't think so. Yeah.
Well, we'll have to have you back another time then to get those stories when those games are actually released. But do you guys want to share anything else about Merchants of Andromeda, which should be on Kickstarter roughly at the time of this recording? And that's really what inspired this development topic, because it went through so many highs and lows of development. So
oh boy, like I've just every other game I've put into development has kind of been smooth. But this one was just such a rocky path. But I think at the end of the day, we found just like such a beautiful place forward for this game. I'm very excited to see how people react to it, because I think a lot of love and care and attention from the publishing to the art to the development has been really just like put into this game from so many different people that I'm really excited to see just kind of this game come out. As far as like things that I think it does something that very few other games do, which is this ability to like have an auction game, but like what you're winning is like evaluating the opportunity, right? To play a mini game to improve your standing for the longevity of the game, and trying to weigh like because it's so much less clear of like, oh, if I win this auction, I get this thing and this thing's worth 8 points. So I definitely shouldn't bid more than 8 points worth of value for this thing, right? Like, let's say this thing is going to get me $20. Well, I shouldn't bid more than $20 on it, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And there's a lot of auction games that I feel like fall flat there. What I feel like Merchants of Andromeda does beautifully is like you're bidding money, and the mini games will all pay out money. But to what degree they pay out money is really based on your standing in that mini game, and the opportunity to interact with that mini game will improve your standings. But to what degree and at what point and at what value is trying to figure that out, which is just like an incredibly like fun decision space to enter into, which is what I think I always wanted this game to be. Is like, I think I kept telling Robert, make more silly things happen. Make more wacky things happen. Like, I want this game to like excel in the fact that like people just do this so many times in the game where they go, oh my God, like that was incredible. Or, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. And in fact, currently right now, Robert is actually working on a promo pack of tiles and cards for this game that are actually going to like bring that level of like craziness kind of to another level, which is really exciting to see what's going to happen there.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this game. I'll mention too, as somebody who often worries, when a publisher externally develops a Knizia game, does it still feel like a Knizia game? I can say as somebody who's played this and as somebody who's played lots of Robert's designs, like, yeah, it still maintains that Knizia philosophy. So to those of you hardcore fans who might be worried, I'd say don't worry about it. It's really excellent, and I'm super excited to play the final version of this eventually. So yeah, you can find that game currently on Kickstarter, Merchants of Andromeda, plus 2 more from All Play. And Robert, where can people find you?
I made a professional Instagram account recently. So
yeah, go follow Robert.
Go follow me there. Yeah, I think it's Rob Hovak Games is what it is. So you can find me there. I think I'm just going to post just general stuff like, here's a prototype I'm working on, here's where you can find the next game, stuff like that. So that is now a place you can find me.
Yeah, and our next Kickstarter, which will probably be in roughly April, will feature one of Robert's games as well. And yeah, we're super excited to reveal that pretty soon here. But in the meantime, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thanks, Joe and Robert, for joining. You can like and subscribe to this video to help us find more people and keep the good times going with the Bits with Joe and Nick, and sometimes guest stars like Robert. So thank you guys again for joining. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.